Welcome, dear friends. Settle in, take a deep breath, and let's travel back together to a fascinating time in history. Today, we're going to meet some of the most mysterious and misunderstood figures from the past, the plague doctors. Now, when you picture a plague doctor, you might see that iconic beaked mask in your mind. That strange, bird-like silhouette that seems both eerie and oddly captivating. But there's so much more to their story than that famous image. So let's begin at the beginning, shall we? Our first fact takes us to the year 1619. This is when a French physician named Charles de Lorme designed the costume we know so well today. Imagine being tasked with creating protective clothing during one of history's deadliest pandemics. De Lorme was the chief physician to King Louis XIII, and he wanted to protect doctors who were brave enough to treat plague victims. His invention would become legendary. Now about that distinctive beak. This is our second fact, and it's quite ingenious when you understand a medical theory of the time. The mask's long, curved beak wasn't just for show. It was actually filled with aromatic herbs, dried flowers, and spices. Think of fragrant rose petals, sweet cloves, soothing lavender, perhaps some camphor or mint. Doctors believed these pleasant scents would protect them from the bad air they thought carried disease. This was called miasma theory, and while we now know germs work differently, there's something almost poetic about doctors trying to fight death with flowers. Let's look at what else they wore. Our third fact reveals that the full costume was quite elaborate. The plague doctor would don a long, waxed leather or canvas overcoat that went all the way down to their ankles. This coat was also meant to keep the bad air from touching their skin. Picture it. Heavy, dark material, treated with wax or suet to make it less permeable. It must have been incredibly hot and uncomfortable, especially during summer outbreaks, but these doctors wore it anyway. Fact number 4 brings us to an interesting detail. Plague doctors carried a wooden cane or stick. Now, you might wonder why a doctor would need a walking stick. This tool served multiple purposes. They could use it to examine patients without having to touch them directly. They could lift blankets, point to areas of infection, or even use it to keep desperate family members at a safe distance. It was both a medical instrument and a practical barrier. Sometimes, sadly, it was used to push away those who had already died. The cane represented the strange distance plague doctors had to maintain, even while trying to help. Our fifth fact might surprise you. Not all plague doctors were fully trained physicians. In fact, many were what we might call secondary doctors, or sometimes people with only basic medical knowledge. Cities were desperate during outbreaks, and they would hire whoever was willing to do this dangerous work. Some were young doctors, just starting their careers. Others were older practitioners who perhaps hadn't been very successful in normal times. A few were simply brave individuals who stepped up when needed. This doesn't diminish their courage, though. They walked into infected homes when others ran away. For our sixth fact, let's talk about payment. Plague doctors were actually municipal employees, hired by cities and towns to treat everyone during an outbreak, rich and poor alike. They received a salary, which was often quite good given the risks involved. Some contracts even promised to take care of their families if they died in service. These were among the first public health workers in the sense we understand today. They belonged to the community, not to individual wealthy patrons. Fact number 7 takes us to their daily duties. Plague doctors didn't just treat the sick. They also kept records of plague deaths, performed autopsies to try to understand the disease, and witnessed wills for dying patients. Imagine the emotional weight of that. Day after day, documenting loss, trying to find patterns, sitting with people in their final moments. They were physicians, yes, but also record keepers, witnesses, and sometimes the last friendly face a person would see. Our eighth fact is about their treatments. Now brace yourself, because some of these sound quite strange to our modern ears. Plague doctors would sometimes lance the swollen buboes, those painful, swollen lymph nodes that gave the bubonic plague its name. They might apply pastes made from various substances, rose oil, or even crushed emeralds if the patient was wealthy. Some treatments included having patients eat crushed minerals or drink vinegar mixtures. Were these effective? Sadly, most were not, but the doctors were working with the best knowledge they had at the time, trying everything they could think of to save lives. Let's end this first segment with our ninth and 10th facts, which are connected. The plague doctor's costume, believe it or not, wasn't actually used during the Black Death of the 14th century, which killed millions across Europe. That iconic outfit came much later, in the 17th century, during later plague outbreaks. The Black Death happened in the 1300s, but the beaked mask we all recognize didn't appear until more than 250 years later. It's fascinating how this later image has become, in our minds, the symbol of all plague eras. And our 10th fact, despite the popular image, plague doctors were actually relatively rare. Not every city had them, and not every outbreak saw doctors in those dramatic costumes. The image has been amplified through art, theater, and later, popular culture. But in their own time, most people might never have seen a plague doctor in full costume. They were remarkable exceptions, not the rule. So there we have it, friends. 10 facts about plague doctors. These mysterious figures who walk the line between hope and despair, between medicine and ritual. In our next segment, we'll explore more about their world, their challenges, and the remarkable courage they showed. For now, take a moment to appreciate how far we've come in medical understanding, and perhaps to honor those who did their best with the knowledge they had, even when facing unimaginable circumstances. Rest easy, and we'll continue our journey together soon. Welcome back, dear friends. I hope you're feeling comfortable and relaxed. Let's continue our gentle journey into the world of plague doctors, those enigmatic figures from history who fascinated us so much in our first segment. Today, we're going to explore more of their story, uncovering details that might surprise you, humanize these masked figures, and help us understand what life was truly like for them. Our 11th fact takes us to Venice. This beautiful Italian city, built on water and known for its masks and carnival traditions, played a special role in plague doctor history. Venice was one of the first cities to officially hire plague doctors and create formal contracts for them. In 1348, during the Black Death, Venice appointed dedicated physicians to treat the poor who couldn't afford private doctors. While they didn't yet wear the famous beaked masks, this was the beginning of the plague doctor as a public servant. Venice understood something important. Disease doesn't respect wealth or status, and protecting everyone protects the whole community. Fact number 12 brings us to an interesting protection method. Beneath their long coats, plague doctors often wore leather breeches and tucked their shirts into their pants. Every opening in their clothing was sealed or tucked away. They wore leather gloves that came up over their coat sleeves. Their boots were high and sturdy. The goal was to create a complete barrier between their skin and the outside world. Imagine getting dressed for work and knowing you need to seal yourself away from the world, like preparing for a journey to another planet. That was their daily routine during outbreaks. Our 13th fact is about those glass eyepieces in the mask. The plague doctor's mask had 2 glass openings for the eyes, like little windows to the world. These glass pieces served a double purpose. First, they protected the doctor's eyes from splashes or discharge from patients. Second, they created another barrier against that bad air they feared. Some historians note that the glass would often fog up from the doctor's breath, making it difficult to see. Picture trying to perform delicate medical work while peering through foggy glass, wearing heavy leather gloves, and a hot, uncomfortable costume. It speaks to their dedication. Let's move to our 14th fact, about their payment structure. When the city hired a plague doctor, the contract was quite specific. They would receive a base salary, but they were also allowed to charge wealthy patients extra fees for private visits. This created an interesting dynamic. The doctor's primary duty was to the public, to anyone who needed help, but they could supplement their income with house calls to rich families. Some contracts specified exactly how much they could charge. The city of Orvieto in Italy, for example, paid their plague doctor 30 florins for 4 months of work during a 1348 outbreak, which was considered generous for the time. Fact 15 reveals something touching. Plague doctors often made special arrangements for their own families before accepting their positions. They would write wills, make provisions for their wives and children, and sometimes arrange for their families to leave the city during the outbreak. They knew the risks. Some contracts even included clauses promising the city would care for their families if they died. This wasn't paranoia, it was realism. Many plague doctors did die from the disease they were fighting, but they took the job anyway, making sure their loved ones would be protected before walking into danger. Our 16th fact might make you smile. Despite the serious nature of their work, plague doctors became figures of dark humor and satire even in their own time. Street performers and actors would dress up as plague doctors in comedic plays. Artists drew cartoons of them. This wasn't necessarily disrespectful. It was how people coped with fear. By making the scary figure into something they could laugh at, people felt a little more in control. The plague doctor became part of popular culture, appearing in festivals and performances. Even terror needs relief, and humor has always been one way humans handled difficult times. Fact 17 takes us into the science of the time. The four humors theory dominated medical thinking during the plague years. Doctors believed the body contained 4 fluids: blood, phlegm, yellow bile, and black bile. Disease happened when these humors became imbalanced. So plague doctors would try to rebalance their patients using various methods. They might perform bloodletting, drawing blood to reduce what they thought was an excess. They might recommend purging through vomiting or bowel movements. They might try to make patients sweat. To our modern understanding, many of these treatments actually weaken patients further. But in the context of their time, these doctors were following systematic, logical approaches based on centuries of medical tradition. Our 18th fact is about the plague doctor's oath. Like other physicians, plague doctors took professional oaths, though the specific wording varied by region and time period. Some swore to treat rich and poor alike during the outbreak. Others promised not to leave the city until the plague had passed. Some vowed to keep accurate records and report honestly about the death tolls. Breaking these oaths could mean professional disgrace, fines, or even imprisonment. These commitments meant something profound. In an age when many wealthy doctors fled cities at the first sign of plague, plague doctors contractually bound themselves to stay. Fact 19 brings us to their living arrangements during outbreaks. Many plague doctors lived in special isolation during their service. Some cities provided them with dedicated housing, keeping them separate from their own families to reduce the risk of transmission. They might stay in a building near the city's pest house, a hospital specifically for plague victims. Others lived in their own homes, but slept in separate quarters from their families. Meals might be left outside their doors. They existed in a strange liminal space, not quite part of normal society anymore, dedicated entirely to their dangerous work. It must have been profoundly lonely. Let's end this segment with our 20th fact, which is rather beautiful. Some plague doctors kept detailed journals and wrote letters describing their experiences. A few of these documents survive today. In them, we find not just medical observations, but reflections on mortality, fear, courage, and hope. They wrote about patients who recovered and brought them joy. They wrote about the weight of those they couldn't save. They described the empty streets, the silence of cities, usually filled with life. These writings remind us that behind the strange masks were real people, feeling deeply, thinking constantly, and trying to find meaning in the midst of catastrophe. Thank you for staying with me on this journey, friends. We've learned more about the daily realities of plague doctors, their contracts and commitments, their methods, and their humanity. They were people doing an extraordinary job during extraordinary times, bound by oaths, separated from loved ones, working within the medical understanding they had. In our next segment, we'll explore even more fascinating aspects of their story. Until then, rest well, and carry with you the thought that courage has always existed, even in the darkest times. Peace be with you. Welcome back, dear friends. I'm so glad you're here with me again. Let's settle in and continue our exploration of these remarkable figures from history. Each time we meet, we peel back another layer of mystery surrounding the plague doctors, discovering the real people and fascinating details beneath those iconic masks. Our 21st fact takes us to the streets themselves. When a plague doctor walked through a city during an outbreak, people would often react in complex ways. Some felt relief, knowing medical help was present. Others felt dread, because the plague doctor's presence meant death was near. Children were taught to stay away from them. People would press themselves against walls or duck into doorways to avoid getting too close. The plague doctor became a walking symbol of the epidemic itself, both feared and needed. Yet they continued their rounds, day after day, despite knowing their very appearance filled people with anxiety. Fact number 22 reveals something about their bells and instruments. Some plague doctors carried bells or wooden clappers as they walked. The sound would warn people of their approach, giving citizens time to clear the streets or stay inside. It's a haunting image, isn't it? The sound of a bell echoing through empty streets, announcing that the doctor was making his rounds. In some cities, they were required by law to make such announcements. The bell served both as a warning and as a way to maintain that crucial distance everyone sought during outbreaks. Our 23rd fact explores the autopsy work that plague doctors performed. Remember, this was a time when cutting open human bodies was controversial and sometimes forbidden by religious authorities. But during plague outbreaks, cities often gave plague doctors special permission to perform autopsies, hoping they might discover the cause of the disease. These doctors would carefully examine the bodies of plague victims, documenting the swollen buboes, the blackened skin, the internal damage. They were searching for patterns, for understanding. While their conclusions were limited by the medical knowledge of their time, their careful observations and records became valuable historical documents that help us understand plague outbreaks even today. Fact 24 brings us to an interesting detail about regional differences. Not every plague doctor wore the exact same costume. In different parts of Europe, the outfits varied. Some regions favored different colors. Not all were the black we typically imagine. Some Italian plague doctors wore white or light-colored coats. Some areas had shorter beaks on their masks, while others had longer ones. The basic principle remained the same: create a barrier against disease, but local tailors and doctors adapted the design based on available materials, climate, and local customs. It's a reminder that there wasn't one single plague doctor, but rather many individuals, each working within their own context. Our 25th fact might surprise you. Plague doctors sometimes treated animals as well as humans. During plague outbreaks, pets and livestock also fell ill, and people worried that animals might spread the disease. While we now know that fleas from rats were the primary vector for bubonic plague, People at the time didn't understand this mechanism. Plague doctors would sometimes be called upon to examine household animals, barn animals, or even the rats themselves. Some cities ordered mass killings of cats and dogs, tragically not understanding that cats were actually helping by hunting the rats. The plague doctors were caught in the middle of these decisions, trying to advise based on incomplete knowledge. Fact 26 takes us to their fragrances and perfumes. Beyond the herbs in their masks, plague doctors would often douse themselves in strong-smelling vinegars and aromatic oils. Rose water, camphor oil, and especially vinegar were considered protective. Some would soak their gloves in these substances. Others would carry small sponges soaked in aromatic vinegar, holding them to their noses when they removed their masks briefly. The irony is that while these substances didn't protect against plague bacteria, vinegar does have some antimicrobial properties. They weren't entirely wrong, just working with incomplete information. And imagine the smell, a mixture of leather, wax, sweat, dried flowers, strong vinegar, and the scent of sickness. It must have been overwhelming. Our 27th fact reveals something about their assistants. Plague doctors didn't always work alone. In some cities, they had helpers called plague bearers or corpse carriers. These were often convicted criminals who were given the choice between this dangerous work or harsher punishment. They would help move bodies, clean infected homes, and assist the doctor with various tasks. It was grim work, and these assistants faced the same risks as the doctors, but with far less respect or compensation. Some cities marked these workers with special clothes or symbols so people would know to avoid them. They were the forgotten figures in plague history, doing necessary work that no one else would do. Fact 28 brings us to the concept of quarantine houses. Plague doctors worked closely with lazarettos or pest houses, special facilities where plague victims were isolated. The word quarantine actually comes from the Italian quaranta, meaning 40, because ships and people were often isolated for 40 days. Plague doctors would make daily rounds to these facilities, treating dozens or even hundreds of patients. The pest houses were often former monasteries, large homes, or buildings outside city walls. They were overcrowded, undersupplied, and heartbreaking places. Yet the plague doctors showed up every day, bringing what comfort and treatment they could. Our 29th fact is about their survival rates. You might wonder, did plague doctors die at higher rates than others? The answer is complicated. Some did contract plague and die. However, some historians believe that plague doctors might have developed partial immunity over time through repeated low-level exposure. Others suggest that the costume, despite being based on incorrect medical theory, might have actually provided some physical barrier against flea bites. Some plague doctors served through multiple outbreaks over many years and survived, whether through luck, some biological protection, or the costume's accidental effectiveness. Plague doctors as a group seem to have had better survival odds than you might expect. Still, the risk was very real, and their courage was genuine. Let's conclude this segment with our 30th fact, a touching one. Despite everything, the fear, the death, the isolation, some plague doctors wrote about moments of hope. They documented cases where patients recovered. They described the joy of seeing a family reunited when someone survived. They wrote about the first days when new plague cases stopped appearing, that careful optimism that maybe, finally, the outbreak was ending. In their journals and letters, among all the darkness, there are these small bright spots. A child who recovered and brought them flowers. A grateful family who sang songs outside their window. These moments reminded them why they continued their work, why they risked everything. Even in the worst times, humanity finds ways to shine through. Thank you for joining me again, dear friends. We've walked the plague-ridden streets together, heard the warning bells, and glimpsed both the sorrow and the hope that plague doctors carried with them. In our next segment, we'll continue uncovering more fascinating details about these mysterious figures. Until then, rest peacefully, and perhaps take a moment to appreciate the healers and helpers in your own life, those who show up even when things are difficult. Be well, and I'll see you soon. Welcome back, dear friends. It's wonderful to have you here again for another part of our journey. Take a deep breath, relax, and let's continue exploring the fascinating world of plague doctors together. We've come so far already, and there's still so much more to discover. Our 31st fact takes us to an unexpected place, the theater. The plague doctor's distinctive appearance made its way onto the stage, particularly in Italian commedia dell'arte performances. A character called Il Dottore, or the Doctor, would sometimes appear in these comedic plays, wearing a mask reminiscent of the plague doctor. Over time, this theatrical tradition helped cement the plague doctor's image in popular imagination. The stage doctor wasn't always specifically a plague doctor, but the visual connection was there. It's fascinating how tragedy transforms into theater, how the things that frighten us become the things we perform, perhaps as a way of processing collective trauma. Fact 32 reveals something about their contracts and accountability. Plague doctors had to submit regular reports to city officials. They documented how many patients they'd seen, how many had died, which neighborhoods were most affected, and what treatments they tried. Some cities required daily reports. Others wanted weekly summaries. This wasn't just bureaucracy. It was early public health data collection. City councils used these reports to make decisions about quarantines, resource allocation, and when it might be safe to reopen markets or churches. The plague doctor was part physician, part public health official, part data collector. Their observations helped cities respond more effectively, even if they couldn't cure the disease itself. Our 33rd fact explores the contents of their medical bags. A plague doctor's bag was filled with interesting items. They carried lancets for lancing buboes, cauterizing irons for burning wounds closed, jars of leeches for bloodletting, and various herbal preparations. They might have bread that had been held against buboes, yes, you heard that right, which they believed would draw out the disease. They carried containers of theriac, a complex mixture of dozens of ingredients, including opium and viper flesh that was considered a universal antidote. They had amulets and charms that patients believed would help, even if the doctor was skeptical. And always, they carried vinegar and aromatic substances. Their bag was part pharmacy, part toolkit, part hope chest. Fact 34 brings us to an interesting social detail. Plague doctors occupied a strange social position. They were respected for their courage and needed desperately, yet people also avoided them and sometimes looked down on them. They interacted with the sick and the dead, which made them spiritually unclean in some people's minds. After an outbreak ended, some plague doctors found it difficult to return to normal medical practice because patients didn't want to be treated by someone associated with the plague. They existed in a liminal space, neither fully part of society nor completely outside it. Some became wealthy from their plague work, but found themselves socially isolated. It's a poignant reminder that heroes aren't always welcomed home with open arms. Our 35th fact is about religious tensions. The relationship between plague doctors and the church was complex. Some clergy saw plague as divine punishment and questioned whether fighting it was going against God's will. Other religious leaders strongly supported the doctor's work, seeing healing as a divine calling. Plague doctors sometimes clashed with priests over treatment approaches or whether last rites should take precedence over medical intervention. Yet many plague doctors were deeply religious themselves, seeing their work as a form of service to God. They would pray with patients and some wrote about wrestling with theological questions. Why does God allow such suffering? Is healing possible when death is everywhere? These weren't just medical practitioners. They were people grappling with profound spiritual questions. Fact 36 reveals something about women in plague medicine. While the iconic plague doctor is typically depicted as male, women also played crucial roles during plague outbreaks. Midwives and female healers treated plague patients, though they rarely wore the elaborate costumes or received official contracts like male physicians. Nuns in convents often became caregivers to plague victims, running makeshift hospitals and providing comfort to the dying. Some women worked as nurses in pest houses. Their work was often undocumented and certainly undervalued, but they were there nonetheless, showing the same courage as their male counterparts. History has been less kind in remembering them, but their contributions were vital. Our 37th fact takes us to the economics of plague. Plague outbreaks created strange economic situations. When a plague doctor died, their belongings were often burned or buried to prevent contagion, which meant their families lost valuable property. Some cities compensated families for these losses, others didn't. Meanwhile, the demand for protective equipment, herbs, and medical supplies would skyrocket during outbreaks, making some merchants wealthy. The cost of hiring plague doctors put financial strain on city treasuries. Some cities went into debt paying for plague response. Others raised special taxes. The plague didn't just kill people. It reshaped entire economies, and plague doctors were at the center of these financial pressures. Fact 38 explores their relationship with burial practices. Plague doctors often had to coordinate with grave diggers and decide when bodies could be moved. During severe outbreaks, bodies accumulated faster than they could be buried. Plague doctors would certify deaths, sometimes mark homes where deaths occurred, and advise on burial locations. Mass graves became necessary in the worst outbreaks. The doctor would oversee these grim operations, trying to balance religious burial customs with public health necessity. It must have been emotionally devastating work, watching the death toll climb, knowing that each number in their reports represented a person, a family, a loss. Our 39th fact is about specialized tools. Some plague doctors developed or used specialized instruments. There were unique forceps for handling infected materials without direct contact. Some created long-handled spoons for administering medicine from a distance. Others had special rods with sponges on the end for cleaning wounds without getting too close. Innovation born of necessity. These tools might seem crude by modern standards, but they represented creative problem-solving in the face of a deadly challenge. Each tool was an attempt to maintain both healing touch and protective distance, a paradox at the heart of the plague doctor's work. Let's end this segment with our 40th fact, which is rather touching. Some plague doctors created small tokens or gifts for children who were ill. Little carved wooden figures, drawings, or simple toys. They understood that a frightened child needed more than medicine. They needed comfort. These small acts of kindness weren't in any contract or medical text. They came from the doctor's own humanity, their recognition that healing involves more than just treating disease. In a world of death and masks and fear, these tiny gestures of warmth mattered enormously. They remind us that even in the darkest circumstances, people find ways to offer comfort, to connect, to care. Thank you for staying with me through another segment, dear friends. We've explored the social complexities, the practical tools, the economic pressures, and the simple human kindness that defined the plague doctor's world. We're nearly halfway through our journey together. In our next segment, we'll discover even more fascinating details about these remarkable figures. Until then, rest well. And perhaps remember that healing comes in many forms, sometimes in medicine, sometimes in data and planning, and sometimes in a small wooden toy given to a frightened child. Peace be with you. Our 49th fact is about the aftermath. When a plague outbreak finally ended, cities would hold cleansing rituals. Plague doctors would often supervise the fumigation of homes, the burning of infected materials, and the purification of public spaces. Sulfur smoke, vinegar washes, and fire were used to cleanse buildings. The plague doctor's role didn't end when patients stopped dying. They had to help the city transition back to health, both physical and psychological. They advised on when markets could reopen, when people could gather again, when life could cautiously resume. This transition period required wisdom and caution. Open up too quickly and risk another outbreak. Wait too long and economic devastation deepens. Let's conclude this segment with our 50th fact, a milestone in our journey together. Despite everything, the fear, the death, the isolation, the criticism, the impossible working conditions, many plague doctors wrote about finding purpose in their work. They described feeling that they were doing something meaningful, something important, even when success was rare. One Italian plague doctor wrote, "I may not cure them, but I can sit with them. I can ease their fear. I can record their names so they are not forgotten." This sense of purpose sustained them through the darkest moments. It's a powerful reminder that meaning isn't always found in victory. Sometimes it's found in simply showing up, in bearing witness, in refusing to abandon others in their time of need. Thank you for reaching this halfway point with me, dear friends. 50 facts explored, 50 more to go. We've learned about colors and training, marked houses and mentorship, fraud and fumigation, and the deep sense of purpose that kept these doctors going. In our next segment, we'll continue discovering the layers of this fascinating history together. Until then, rest peacefully, and perhaps reflect on what gives your own life meaning, especially during difficult times. I'll see you soon. Be well. Welcome back, dear friends. I'm delighted you're continuing this journey with me. We've crossed the halfway mark, and now we venture into the second half of our exploration. Let's discover more together, gently uncovering the lives and experiences of these fascinating historical figures. Our 51st fact takes us to the subject of plague doctor families. Many plague doctors came from families with medical backgrounds, fathers, uncles, or brothers who were physicians or apothecaries. Medicine often ran in families during this era, with knowledge passed down through generations. But taking a plague doctor position was something else entirely. Family members might support the decision while also grieving in advance, knowing the terrible risks. Some families were proud, others were frightened and angry. Letters between plague doctors and their families reveal this tension. Love mixed with fear, pride mixed with desperate pleas to be careful. These doctors weren't solitary heroes. They were sons, husbands, fathers, making choices that affected everyone they loved. Fact 52 reveals something about their feet. This might seem like an odd detail, but plague doctors spent enormous amounts of time walking. They traversed entire cities on foot, climbing stairs to upper-floor apartments, walking between the city center and outlying pest houses, trudging through all weather. Their boots took a beating. Some doctors' expense reports include multiple requests for boot repairs or replacements. Blisters, foot pain, and exhaustion were constant companions. Imagine doing all that walking while wearing heavy, sealed leather clothing in summer heat. The physical toll of their work went far beyond exposure to disease. Their bodies ached from the sheer labor of caring for so many people across such distances. Our 53rd fact explores the concept of plague tokens. In some regions, people who recovered from plague were given tokens or certificates, proving they'd survived. Plague doctors sometimes issued or verified these documents. The tokens were valuable because people believed survivors couldn't catch or spread plague again, which was partially true for bubonic plague immunity. These tokens allowed people to return to work, especially in jobs involving food handling or caring for others. Plague doctors thus served as gatekeepers to economic recovery, deciding who could safely rejoin society. It was another layer of responsibility, another way their judgment affected people's lives beyond just medical treatment. Fact 54 brings us to the sounds of plague time. Plague doctors worked in an eerily quiet world. During severe outbreaks, cities became unnaturally silent. Markets closed. Church bells were restricted to avoid spreading panic. People stayed indoors. The main sounds were footsteps echoing in empty streets, the creak of the plague doctor's leather costume, occasional cries from windows, and the rumble of carts collecting bodies. Some plague doctors wrote about this silence, how unsettling it was, how a city that should be alive with voices and activity became almost tomb-like. They moved through this silence like ghosts themselves, the only sound their warning bells or the tap of their canes on cobblestones. Our 55th fact is about artistic representations. Plague doctors appeared in paintings, woodcuts, and sketches during and after plague times. Artists were fascinated by their appearance. Some artworks portrayed them as heroic figures, others as sinister or even demonic characters. These images spread across Europe, and each generation of artists reinterpreted them. By the 18th and 19th centuries, plague doctors had become romanticized figures in art, representing mortality, mystery, and the Gothic aesthetic. The reality of their work, the sweat, the fatigue, the heartbreak, was often lost in these artistic representations. But the images did preserve their memory, ensuring that later generations would remember, even if imperfectly, these remarkable people. Fact 56 reveals something about communication barriers. Plague doctors often worked in multilingual or multicultural cities like Venice, Marseille, or Amsterdam. They needed to communicate with patients who might speak different languages or dialects. Some doctors learned basic phrases in multiple languages. Others relied on translators or used visual demonstrations to explain treatments. The mask itself created another barrier. Voices were muffled, facial expressions invisible. Imagine trying to comfort a dying patient when they can't see your face or clearly hear your words. Plague doctors had to convey compassion through gesture, through tone of voice, through the gentle placement of a hand. Communication became an act of creativity and persistence. Our 57th fact takes us to the subject of plague doctor diaries as literature. Some of these journals became published works, read by other physicians across Europe. They weren't just medical records, but reflections on death, duty, faith, and human nature. One famous example is the writings of Dutch plague Dr. Isbren van Diemerbroek, who documented the 1635 to 1636 plague in Nijmegen. His observations were detailed, honest, and sometimes beautiful in their descriptions of human courage and suffering. These texts became teaching tools for future physicians and historical documents for us today. They remind us that plague doctors were often educated, thoughtful people who could articulate their experiences with eloquence and insight. Fact 58 explores superstitions they encountered. Plague doctors worked among populations with strong folk beliefs. People might refuse treatment because they believed the plague was a curse that medicine couldn't break. Others insisted on amulets, prayers, or rituals alongside medical treatment. Some believed that certain saints protected against plague, or that carrying specific herbs or stones would help. Plague doctors had to navigate these beliefs carefully. Some were skeptical but pragmatic, allowing harmless folk remedies if they gave patients comfort. Others tried to educate people about medical approaches. A few embraced certain folk practices themselves, incorporating them into their treatment protocols. The boundary between medicine and magic was blurrier then, and plague doctors stood right at that boundary. Our 59th fact is about seasonal patterns. Plague outbreaks often followed seasonal cycles, typically worsening in warm months and declining in winter, though this wasn't always the case. Plague doctors learned to recognize these patterns. Spring brought anxiety. Would this be a plague year? Summer brought crisis and overwhelming work. Autumn sometimes brought hope as cases declined. Winter offered rest, but also preparation for the next potential outbreak. Some plague doctors worked seasonally, signing contracts for the warm months when plague was most active. Others remained on call year-round. This seasonal rhythm shaped their entire lives, creating an annual cycle of tension, crisis, relief, and anticipation. Let's conclude with our 60th fact about unexpected friendships. In the isolation of plague work, plague doctors sometimes formed close bonds with others in similar positions, fellow doctors, priests who gave last rites, grave diggers, pest house administrators. These were people who understood the work's toll in ways others couldn't. Letters between plague doctors reveal these friendships, marked by dark humor, mutual support, and shared understanding. They would encourage each other during difficult times, share treatment observations, and mourn together when colleagues fell ill. These friendships were forged in extraordinary circumstances, creating connections that lasted lifetimes. Some plague doctors credited these relationships with keeping them sane during the darkest periods of their work. Thank you for continuing this journey with me, dear friends. We've explored family tensions and aching feet, silent cities and artistic legacies, language barriers and unexpected friendships. Each fact reveals another dimension of these complex, fully human figures behind the masks. In our next segment, we'll discover even more layers of their fascinating story. Until then, rest well, and perhaps appreciate the friendships in your own life. Those people who understand your struggles and stand beside you through difficult times. Peace be with you, and I'll see you soon. Welcome back, dear friends. Here we are together again, continuing our gentle exploration of the plague doctor's world. We're moving through the second half of our journey now, and each segment brings us deeper into understanding these remarkable individuals. Let's discover more together. Our 61st fact takes us to the subject of compensation disputes. Not all cities paid their plague doctors promptly or fairly. Some doctors had to fight for their wages after an outbreak ended, submitting appeals to city councils or taking their cases to courts. Records show plague doctors arguing that they'd seen more patients than initially contracted, or that they'd work longer hours, or that the danger had been greater than expected. Some cities, devastated financially by plague, simply couldn't pay. A few plague doctors died before receiving full payment, leaving their families to pursue the debts. These disputes reveal the practical, sometimes frustrating realities beneath the heroic image. Even heroes have to worry about paying their bills. Fact 62 reveals something about their homes. Many plague doctors maintain two residences during outbreaks, their family home and a separate lodging where they stayed during active plague work. This separation protected their families, but also isolated the doctors. Their work lodgings were often sparse, furnished with only necessities. Some were rooms above apothecaries or near pest houses. Others were small apartments the city provided. Plague doctors would return to these lonely rooms after exhausting days, eating simple meals alone, writing their reports by candlelight, perhaps reading letters from family members they couldn't safely visit. Home was so close yet impossibly far away. Our 63rd fact explores the role of music. This might surprise you. but music played a part in plague times. Some plague doctors wrote about hearing music drifting from windows, families singing together, perhaps for the last time. Musicians were sometimes hired to play in pest houses, believing music could lift spirits and aid healing. A few plague doctors were musically inclined themselves, playing instruments during rare moments of rest. Music was one of the few joys available during plague times, a reminder of beauty and humanity amid so much loss. Some cities organized concerts after outbreaks ended, celebrations of survival where plague doctors were honored guests. These musical moments punctuated the silence we discussed earlier, brief islands of melody in a sea of quiet suffering. Fact 64 brings us to the concept of plague gardens. Some plague doctors cultivated or maintained herb gardens specifically for plague medicine. These gardens grew the aromatic plants used in their masks and treatments: lavender, rosemary, sage, mint, wormwood, and rue. Tending these gardens became a form of meditation for some doctors, a peaceful activity between the chaos of patient visits. The gardens were practical resources, but also symbols of hope, the act of planting and nurturing representing faith in a future beyond the plague. Some monastery gardens that supplied plague doctors still exist today, now historical sites where you can walk among the same herbs those doctors once harvested centuries ago. Our 65th fact is about literacy and education. Not all plague doctors could read and write fluently, especially those hired quickly during emergencies. Some dictated their reports to scribes. Others learned to write specifically for their plague work, their penmanship improving over time in surviving documents. This reminds us that the plague doctor population was diverse. Some were university-educated physicians. Others were practical healers who learned through apprenticeship and experience. Both types contributed valuable knowledge. The literate doctors documented theories and observations. The less formally educated doctors often had practical wisdom about herbal remedies and patient care passed down through generations. Together, they formed a more complete picture of plague medicine than either group could have alone. Fact 66 reveals something about their relationship with time beyond their working hours. Plague doctors aged rapidly during outbreaks. The stress, exhaustion, poor nutrition, and constant exposure to death took physical tolls. Some doctors' portraits painted before and after plague service show dramatic changes: more lines, grayer hair, a weariness in the eyes. They didn't just lose time during plague years. They lost vitality, their bodies bearing the marks of trauma even after outbreaks ended. Some retired from medicine entirely afterward, unable to continue. Others carried those marks but persisted, perhaps feeling they'd survived for a reason and their experience was too valuable to abandon. Our 67th fact takes us to the subject of plague doctor symbols. Beyond their costumes, plague doctors sometimes carried or displayed symbolic items. Some wore rings or carried tokens with protective symbols, crosses, saints' images, or astrological signs believed to ward off plague. Others kept small religious icons in their pockets or incorporated them into their walking sticks. These weren't just superstition. They were psychological anchors, physical reminders of faith or hope during impossible work. Even the most rational, scientifically minded doctors might carry such items, not because they believed in magic, but because humans need something to hold on to when facing mortality daily. Fact 68 explores the concept of plague doctor networks. Across Europe, plague doctors communicated with each other through letters, sharing observations and treatment ideas. These correspondence networks were early forms of medical information exchange. A doctor in Venice might write to one in Amsterdam about a treatment approach. A physician in Marseille might receive advice from one in London. These letters took weeks or months to arrive, but they created a community of practice that transcended borders. Plague doctors learned they weren't alone in their struggles. Others were fighting the same battle, facing the same questions, and experiencing the same frustrations and small victories. Our 69th fact is about their dreams and nightmares. Several plague doctor journals mention dreams, both literal dreams while sleeping and metaphorical dreams about the future. They wrote about nightmares of endless streets filled with the sick, dreams where they couldn't move fast enough to help everyone. But they also wrote about hopeful dreams, imagining a time when plague would be understood and preventable, envisioning cities healthy and thriving again, dreaming of reuniting with their families. One doctor wrote about a recurring dream of taking off his mask and breathing freely. These dreams reveal their inner lives, the psychological burden they carried even in sleep. Let's conclude this segment with our 70th fact about unexpected learning. Plague outbreaks forced medical innovation and observation in ways normal practice never would. Plague doctors learned about infection patterns, documented disease progression with unprecedented detail, and tested various treatments under crisis conditions. While many treatments failed, this trial and error contributed to medical knowledge. Some plague doctors made observations that, centuries later, would be recognized as surprisingly accurate. They noticed that plague spread more in crowded, dirty areas. They observed that people with certain conditions seemed more vulnerable. They documented that survivors rarely got sick again. These observations, recorded carefully in their journals, became data points for future generations of physicians studying epidemics. Learning happened even amid loss. Thank you for joining me once more, dear friends. We've explored payment disputes and lonely lodgings, music in gardens, aging in dreams, and the learning that emerged from tragedy. 70 facts shared, 30 more ahead of us. In our next segment, we'll continue uncovering the richness of plague doctor history together. Until then, rest peacefully, and perhaps tend to your own gardens, literal or metaphorical, those places where you nurture hope and beauty. Be well, and I'll see you soon. Welcome back, dear friends. I'm so glad you're here with me again. We're drawing closer to the end of our journey together, but there's still so much richness to explore. Let's continue discovering the world of plague doctors, these fascinating figures who seem to reveal something new with each fact we uncover. Our 71st fact takes us to the subject of children of plague doctors. Growing up as a plague doctor's child meant living with constant fear and pride in equal measure. Some children followed in their parents' footsteps, inspired by their courage. Others wanted nothing to do with medicine, having lost a parent to plague or watched them suffer from the work's toll. There are records of plague doctors writing letters to their children, explaining why they did this dangerous work, trying to help them understand. Some letters are heartbreaking, final messages written in case the doctor didn't survive. Others are teaching moments, fathers or mothers hoping to pass on medical knowledge. These children lived in the shadow of the beaked mask, and it shaped their entire lives. Fact 72 reveals something about plague doctor memorials. Some cities erected monuments or plaques honoring plague doctors who died in service. These memorials were often simple, a name carved in stone, a brief inscription, perhaps died serving the sick, or gave his life for others. A few plague doctors had more elaborate memorials, funded by grateful families they'd helped or communities they'd served. These monuments remind us that people recognized the sacrifice at the time, even if later generations forgot. Walking through old European cities today, you can still find some of these memorials, weathered by time but still standing, still remembering. Our 73rd fact explores the concept of plague doctor retirement. For those who survived their service, retirement was complicated. Some doctors were celebrated, and lived comfortably on savings or pensions. Others found themselves forgotten once the crisis passed, struggling financially despite their service. Some continued practicing medicine, but avoided discussing their plague work, perhaps finding the memories too painful. A few became advisors to other cities facing outbreaks, their experience suddenly valuable again. Retirement wasn't an ending, but a transition into living with what they'd witnessed and done, carrying those memories forward into whatever years remained. Fact 74 brings us to an unexpected topic: humor. Despite everything, plague doctors sometimes displayed dark humor in their writings. They made wry observations about the absurdities of their situation, joked grimly about their own mortality, or noted ironic moments. One doctor wrote about a patient who refused treatment because the doctor's mask frightened him more than the plague did. Another described accidentally walking into a door frame because the mask's beak blocked his peripheral vision. This humor wasn't disrespectful to the suffering around them. It was a coping mechanism, a way to release tension and maintain sanity. Humans laugh even in darkness, perhaps especially in darkness. Our 75th fact is about plague doctor assistants who became doctors themselves. We mentioned assistants earlier, but some of these helpers, watching plague doctors work, discovered a calling for medicine. After outbreaks ended, some pursued medical training formally. They'd already seen the worst medicine could offer. They knew the stakes. These individuals often became particularly compassionate physicians, their plague experience giving them deep empathy for suffering and an unshakable commitment to public health. They were plague doctors' unexpected legacy, new healers inspired by witnessing medicine practiced under impossible conditions. Fact 76 reveals something about international recruitment. When plague struck and local doctors were scarce, some cities recruited plague doctors from other countries. These foreign doctors faced additional challenges, different languages, unfamiliar city layouts, and sometimes resentment from locals who viewed them as outsiders. But they came anyway, traveling to plague-stricken cities, because they were needed. Some were adventurous, drawn by high pay and the challenge. Others were idealists, believing medicine transcended borders. Their presence reminds us that healing has always been, at its best, an international endeavor, with knowledge and courage flowing across boundaries. Our 77th fact takes us to the subject of plague doctor widows. Women who lost their husbands to plague faced particular hardships. Many fought for death benefits or pensions promised in their husbands' contracts. Some took over their husbands' medical practices, particularly if they'd worked as informal assistants. Others found themselves in financial crisis, especially if the city was too devastated to pay what was owed. Some widow groups organized, supporting each other and advocating collectively for payment. These women's stories are often overshadowed by their husbands, but are equally important. They dealt with grief, economic uncertainty, and the practical aftermath of heroism. Fact 78 explores the seasonal depression plague doctors experienced. Modern psychologists would recognize symptoms of what we now call seasonal affective disorder, or PTSD, in plague doctor writings. As plague season approached each year, some doctors described increasing anxiety, sleep problems, and depression. The anticipation of what was coming, the death, the exhaustion, the isolation, weighed heavily. Some doctors wrote about spring feeling ominous rather than hopeful, watching for signs that plague might return. They lived with a form of anticipatory grief, mourning losses that hadn't happened yet, but likely would. Mental health wasn't discussed in those terms, but the symptoms were clearly documented. Our 79th fact is about plague doctor innovations that lasted. While many plague treatments were ineffective, some practices plague doctors developed or documented had lasting value. Their emphasis on isolation and quarantine proved fundamentally correct. Their careful record-keeping established templates for epidemiological tracking. Some of their protective equipment concepts, creating barriers between healer and disease, presaged modern protective gear. Their understanding that preventing disease spread was as important as treating it marked a crucial shift in medical thinking. Not everything they did was wrong. Some seeds of modern public health were planted in those desperate times. Let's conclude this segment with our 80th fact about moments of transcendence. This is more abstract, but deeply important. Several plague doctors wrote about experiencing moments during their work that felt almost spiritual, not religious necessarily, but transcendent. Moments when a patient unexpectedly recovered, and the doctor felt profound gratitude. Times when they realized they were doing exactly what they were meant to do, despite the horror. Instances of witnessing such courage in dying patients that they felt changed by it. These moments didn't erase the trauma, but they provided meaning, a sense that their suffering and service connected to something larger than themselves. These experiences sustained them and perhaps explain why some continued to work year after year, outbreak after outbreak. Thank you for continuing this journey with me, dear friends. We've explored children and memorials, retirement and humor, international service and widow struggles, seasonal depression and lasting innovations, and those rare moments of transcendence that made the unbearable somehow bearable. 80 facts shared, 20 more to go. In our next segment, we'll move closer to the end of our time together, discovering the final layers of this remarkable history. Until then, rest peacefully, and perhaps reflect on those moments in your own life that felt larger than yourself, that gave meaning to difficulty. Peace be with you, and I'll see you soon. Welcome back, dear friends. Here we are, approaching the final stretch of our journey together. It's been quite an exploration, hasn't it? Let's continue gently forward, discovering these last precious details about plague doctors, savoring each story as we near the end of our time together. Our 81st fact takes us to the subject of plague doctor poetry. Yes, some plague doctors wrote poetry. In their journals, between medical observations and death counts, you'll sometimes find verses. These poems expressed what prose couldn't capture: the weight of loss, the beauty of a rare recovery, the strangeness of living so close to death. Some wrote about their masks, comparing them to barriers between worlds. Others wrote about the cities they served, transformed into ghost towns. A few composed prayers in verse. This poetry wasn't always skillful by literary standards, but it was deeply human, revealing the artistic impulse that persists even in the darkest circumstances. Creation as an answer to destruction. Fact 82 reveals something about plague doctor meals. Food during plague service was often simple and solitary. Many plague doctors ate alone to protect others from potential contagion. Their meals were left outside their doors or brought by brave assistants who kept their distance. Some doctors wrote about the strange ritual of eating alone day after day, how meals lost their social meaning and became purely functional. Others mentioned losing their appetite entirely during severe outbreaks, forcing themselves to eat just to maintain strength. A few described the paradox of being surrounded by starvation and death while needing to keep themselves fed and healthy. Even something as basic as eating became complicated during plague times. Our 83rd fact explores the concept of plague doctor relics. After plague doctors died, their belongings were usually burned to prevent contagion. This means very few authentic plague doctor artifacts survived. The costumes we see in museums today are mostly reproductions or theatrical versions from later periods. Occasionally, something survived, a medical instrument, a journal that was somehow spared, a portrait. These rare items are precious to historians, tangible connections to real people who lived these experiences. The scarcity of physical objects makes the written records even more valuable. Words survived when objects couldn't. Fact 84 brings us to the subject of plague doctor regulations. Cities created increasingly detailed rules for plague doctors as outbreaks continued over decades. Some regulations specified exactly what doctors could and couldn't do. In Rome, plague doctors were forbidden from entering taverns or churches unnecessarily to limit potential disease spread. In other cities, they had to walk only on certain streets or visit patients in a prescribed order. Some regulations seem almost absurd to us now. Requirements about which hand to use for certain tasks, or how many times to wash with vinegar. But these rules represented attempts to create systems, to impose order on chaos, to feel some control over the uncontrollable. Our 85th fact is about the last plague doctors. As plague outbreaks became less common in Europe, the last major outbreak was in Marseille in 1720. The profession gradually disappeared. The final plague doctors were curiosities, older men whose skills were becoming obsolete as plague faded from European experience. Some of the last plague doctors became historians of the plague, writing comprehensive accounts of outbreaks they'd witnessed. Others trained younger physicians in the broader principles of epidemic response, even if those physicians would never face plague specifically. The profession died with these men, though their legacy lived on in public health practices they'd helped establish. Fact 86 reveals something touching about plague doctor gratitude. After surviving outbreaks, some patients or their families sought out the plague doctors who treated them, bringing gifts of thanks, food, wine, fabric, money, or simple handmade items. These gifts meant everything to doctors, who'd often felt like figures of fear rather than help. Some doctors kept these tokens for years, physical reminders that their work had mattered, that they'd been seen not just as scary masked figures, but as healers who made a difference. Letters of gratitude were particularly treasured, sometimes passed down through families. These expressions of thanks helped heal the healers. Our 87th fact takes us to the subject of plague doctor philosophy. Facing death daily forced plague doctors to develop personal philosophies about mortality, duty, and meaning. Some became deeply religious, seeing their work as divine calling. Others became more skeptical, questioning how a benevolent God could allow such suffering. Some adopted a form of stoicism, accepting death as natural and focusing on doing their duty regardless of outcome. These philosophies evolved over time, shaped by experiences. Reading their reflections, you see people wrestling with the biggest questions humanity faces, forced by circumstance to confront these questions more directly and urgently than most people ever do. Fact 88 explores the concept of plague doctor guilt. Despite doing everything they could, many plague doctors felt profound guilt. Guilt over patients they couldn't save, guilt over surviving when so many died, guilt over moments when fear made them hesitate. Some wrote about specific patients they felt they'd failed, carrying those memories for years. This survivor's guilt was compounded by the question many faced. Was their survival due to their costume and precautions, or simply luck? If luck, did they deserve to live when others, just as worthy, had died? These questions haunted some plague doctors long after outbreaks ended. Our 89th fact is about plague doctor reunions. After outbreaks ended, some plague doctors would gather together, finding solace in the company of others who'd shared similar experiences. These weren't formal organizations, but informal gatherings, perhaps in a tavern or a colleague's home. They would share stories, remember the fallen, and process their experiences together. For some, these gatherings were the only place they could truly be understood. Regular society had moved on, wanting to forget the plague. But these doctors needed to remember, needed to speak about what they'd witnessed. These reunions provided crucial emotional support in an era that didn't have language for trauma care. Let's conclude this segment with our 90th fact about the legacy of compassion. Perhaps the most important thing plague doctors left behind wasn't medical knowledge or protective equipment designs, but a model of compassionate service during crisis. They demonstrated that healers don't abandon communities in their darkest hours. They showed that medical care should be available to everyone, regardless of wealth. They proved that duty and compassion could overcome fear. This legacy influenced how societies thought about public health responsibilities and physicians' obligations. Every modern healthcare worker who stays during an epidemic, who treats dangerous diseases, who serves vulnerable populations, walks in a path those plague doctors helped forge. The costumes are gone, but the spirit of service continues. Thank you for staying with me through this 9th segment, dear friends. We've explored poetry and meals, relics and regulations, the last plague doctors and expressions of gratitude, philosophy and guilt, reunions and lasting legacies. 90 facts shared, just 10 more to go. In our final segment, we'll complete this journey together, bringing our exploration of plague doctors to a gentle close. Until then, rest well, and perhaps think about the legacies you're creating in your own life, the ways your actions and choices ripple forward into the future. Peace be with you, and I'll see you one more time. Welcome back, dear friends, for a final time together. We've traveled so far on this journey, exploring 100 facets of plague doctor history. Let's complete our exploration with these last 10 facts, bringing our story to a gentle, thoughtful close. Thank you for walking this path with me. Our 91st fact takes us to modern plague doctor imagery. Today, the plague doctor has experienced a remarkable cultural revival. The beaked mask appears in festivals, especially Venetian carnival celebrations. It's featured in video games, movies, literature, and art. Steampunk enthusiasts have embraced the aesthetic. The image has been reclaimed and reimagined, sometimes stripped of its historical context, other times used to explore themes of pandemic, mortality, and medical ethics. This modern fascination is complex, partly aesthetic appreciation, partly historical interest, partly our own society processing fears about disease. The plague doctor has become a symbol that each generation reinterprets according to its own needs and anxieties. Fact 92 reveals something about plague doctor education initiatives. In recent decades, some medical schools have incorporated plague doctor history into their curricula, using these historical figures to teach medical ethics, public health principles, and pandemic response. Students study how plague doctors navigated impossible situations, how they made triage decisions, how they balanced self-preservation with duty. These historical case studies help modern medical students think about their own obligations during health crises. The plague doctors, centuries after their deaths, have become teachers once more, their experiences still offering valuable lessons. Our 93rd fact explores plague doctor museums and exhibitions. Several European museums have permanent or rotating exhibitions about plague doctors. The Palazzo Mocenigo in Venice, the Museum of London, and various medical history museums display plague doctor costumes, mostly reproductions, instruments, and documents. These exhibitions serve as memorials, educational resources, and spaces for reflection. Walking through them, visitors can see the actual tools, read the actual words, and connect tangibly with this history. Museums help ensure that plague doctors aren't forgotten, that their service is remembered and honored. Fact 94 brings us to plague doctor research today. Historians, medical historians, and epidemiologists Continue studying plague doctor records. These documents provide data about disease spread, mortality rates, and population impacts that inform current epidemiological models. During the COVID-19 pandemic, some researchers revisited plague doctor writings, finding surprising parallels: the social isolation, the public health debates, the psychological toll on healthcare workers. The plague doctors unknowingly documented patterns that repeat across centuries, helping us understand not just historical plagues, but how societies respond to pandemics in general. Our 95th fact is about plague doctor descendants. Some families can trace their lineage back to plague doctors, proudly claiming this heritage. A few have preserved family stories, letters, or documents passed down through generations. These descendants sometimes become historians or healthcare workers themselves, feeling connected to their ancestors' calling. Others simply carry the knowledge of what their forebears did, a family legacy of courage and service. It's touching that hundreds of years later, people still identify with and honor these connections. Fact 96 reveals something about plague doctor fiction. Plague doctors have inspired countless fictional characters in novels, plays, graphic novels, and films. Some portrayals are historically grounded. Others are fantastical reimaginings. Writers are drawn to plague doctors because they embody fascinating contradictions: healing and fear, science and superstition, humanity and anonymity. These fictional representations, while taking liberties with history, keep plague doctors in cultural consciousness and introduce new generations to their story. Fiction becomes another form of memory, another way these figures persist across time. Our 97th fact takes us to the concept of plague doctor symbolism in modern medicine. Some healthcare workers during recent epidemics have referenced plague doctors when discussing their own experiences. The image of the masked healer, isolated yet serving, resonates powerfully. During COVID-19, some healthcare workers posted images of themselves in PPE alongside historical plague doctor images, drawing explicit parallels. This connection isn't just about masks or pandemics. It's about recognizing themselves in a lineage of healers who stayed when they could have left, who served despite fear, who carried burdens that others couldn't see. The plague doctor has become a symbol of medical courage across centuries. Fact 98 explores plague doctor memoirs that were never published. In archives across Europe, there are plague doctor journals that were never meant for public eyes. Private reflections, raw and unfiltered. These unpublished writings are perhaps even more valuable than published accounts because they're unedited, showing doubts and fears the doctors might have censored for public consumption. Historians who've read these manuscripts describe them as heartbreaking and profound. They reveal plague doctors not as heroes in the traditional sense, but as frightened, uncertain people who chose to act anyway. That makes their courage even more meaningful. Our 99th fact is about the ongoing mystery of plague doctor effectiveness. Historians and medical researchers still debate how effective plague doctors actually were. Did they save lives? Did their treatments help or harm? Did the costume provide any real protection? The honest answer is, we don't entirely know. Some patients treated by plague doctors survived, but whether due to treatment or their own immune systems is unclear. What we do know is that their presence mattered psychologically. They represented society's refusal to abandon the sick. They documented critical information. They maintained social structures during collapse. Perhaps effectiveness should be measured not just in lives saved, but in hope sustained, in communities held together, in knowledge preserved for future generations. And now, our 100th and final fact, the most important one of all. Behind every plague doctor mask was a person, someone with fears and dreams, loves and losses, strengths and doubts. They weren't superhuman. They were bakers' sons and merchants' daughters, ambitious young physicians and desperate older practitioners, idealists and pragmatists. What made them remarkable wasn't that they were extraordinary people, but that they were ordinary people who did extraordinary things. They chose service over safety. They chose presence over flight. They chose to try, even when success was unlikely. That's the heart of their story. Not the strange masks or the historical curiosities, but the simple human decision to help, repeated day after day, patient after patient, outbreak after outbreak. They remind us that courage isn't the absence of fear. It's continuing despite fear. They show us that one person's choice to stay, to care, to serve can matter profoundly. And so, dear friends, we've reached the end of our journey together. 100 facts about plague doctors, their costumes and tools, their challenges and triumphs, their humanity and their legacy. We've walked the empty streets with them, sat in their lonely rooms, witnessed their courage and felt their fear, celebrated their rare victories and mourned their many losses. Thank you for traveling this path with me. Thank you for your patience, your curiosity, and your willingness to learn about these remarkable figures from history. The plague doctors lived centuries ago, but their story remains relevant, a testament to human resilience, compassion, and the enduring power of choosing to help others, even at great personal cost. May you carry forward whatever resonated with you from their story. May you remember that ordinary people can do extraordinary things. May you find your own courage when you need it. And may you always remember that healing, in all its forms, is one of the most beautiful things humans can offer each other. Rest well, dear friends. This journey is complete, but the legacy of those who serve continues, living on in every healer who stays, every person who helps, every act of compassion during dark times. Peace be with you. Thank you for listening. And remember, behind every mask, there's always a human heart.